Hello, good evening, and welcome to Guild Talks, where we discuss important topics in business. My name is Ruben Marian. I am an entrepreneur and founder of more Romanian companies. And today at Guild Talks, we are going to discuss about crisis management essential strategies. How do we manage us and others in crisis? I appreciate that you chose to invest this time together with us this evening. We want to contribute to a positive change in our society. So that's why at Guild Talks, we discuss important topics in business with special guests that have much influence in their field and who inspire us and help us to go to the next level. Everything it's organized with great care. The speakers are especially chosen to be invited to participate to this event based on their principles, values, and proven skills in their field of experience. We organize Guild Talks every quarter. Our objective this evening is that you will learn something new, that you will have a major impact in your organization. We are a community of business leaders, managers, and entrepreneurs that want to contribute to a positive change in the business environment in Romania. Our goal is to help promote responsible leadership and accountability, understood as moral integrity and professional excellence in all spheres of society. We create different contexts like this to learn from each other in community. Each context is carefully organized to facilitate networking with other influential leaders with strong values like integrity, excellence, and contribution. Leaders are inspired and challenged to reach their maximum potential through continuous growth and development, both mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Our purpose today and our challenge for you is that you will have at least one new idea that you can implement in your organization. We also hope that you will be inspired, motivated, and challenged to take your company to the next level. I'm very curious who do we have with us tonight, and maybe if you would like to write in chat, maybe the city, where are you from? This would be lovely. We can use the chat, and also you can use the Q&A to ask questions for the guests later. We appreciate so much the interaction with you, and we see Christian from Cluj. Maybe you can also write. We have Stefan from Iași. It would be wonderful if we can share with each other. And also, if you have a question in a Q&A, maybe you can write the city where you're from, or maybe the business where you're from. So this will be more relevant. I would like to introduce our guests this evening, and our special guests today. It's Mitch Barns. He's an expert in business, working in a variety of business leadership roles in United States, Europe, and Asia. I'm very grateful that Mitch accepted our challenge to come with us this evening. He was this year live in Cluj. Many of us saw him live. I'm curious, maybe you can write in the chat who has been to the last event we had together with Mitch Barns. He was the CEO of Nielsen, a global data and analytics company operating in more than 100 countries with 6 billion annual revenues. He's currently involved as an advisor, board member, and contributor to a number of businesses and organizations, including the Global Leadership Network. So we're very happy to have Mitch Barns this evening with us. Welcome, Mitch. The discussion will be facilitated by Daniel Lar. Daniel is managing director at Yonder with great experience in management and IT. He's also an investor in several companies in Romania, including Saladbox. And what I like about Daniel is that he's an authentic leader. He's passionate to add value to those around him. And he wants to make a contribution to the society volunteering and creating communities in which people understand their purpose and their identity in life. He wants to contribute to positive change by promoting responsible leadership, and I'm very happy that he will facilitate the discussion this evening. So, Daniel, you have the microphone. I'm so happy to have you both tonight with us.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ruben. It's great to be here again at Guild Talks in this new format. And Mitch, thank you so much for taking the time again for us to share your time and experience with the team here. And as Ruben mentioned, you've been recently with us, actually in Romania. So just curious, because so many things have happened in the last couple of months. So how are you doing? What's new for you? Where have you been in this time?
Well, yeah, first, thank you, Ruben, and great to be with you again, Daniel, and good to be with all of you. I had such a great visit back in January when I came to Cluj-Napoca and had a chance to spend some time with all of you and see your beautiful city, learn more about your wonderful country. So it's great to be back with you again. Yeah, since I was there at the end of January, a lot has happened, not only for me, but of course for the entire world. And it's quite an interesting time. You know, when all of this started to unfold, at least at a global level, I started the month of March on a one-week trip to Africa. And I was there to speak to a couple of groups in Lagos in Nigeria, and then in Nairobi in Kenya for the first week of March. And then I came back to the United States and I had one day here at home and, you know, traveling again. That's been my normal life for the past 25 years, traveling again. And second week in March, I embarked on a 4-day, 10-city trip around the United States, working with one of the organizations that I contribute to help them raise some money. And by the time I got home in the middle of March, you know, so much had changed. In fact, it was really fascinating to see how it all unfolded in the news and in society, you know, as I went from city to city that second week of March. Since then, I haven't left. You know, 2 weeks at home, 2 months at home. And I've said to my wife a couple of times in the last few days that without a doubt, this is the longest I've gone in the past 25 years without leaving home. And, you know, that's a blessing in many ways. And so I've taken advantage of that, enjoyed it, got more sleep. I'm eating well, but at the same time, right alongside so many others, looking very much forward to when things can at least start to head back in the direction of whatever it was that we called normal before.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, yeah, great to hear. And I think your experience is quite similar to many of us who haven't spent so much time home for quite a long time, or maybe it's been tens of years since we were home that much. Okay, well, thanks for taking the time to chat with us. And you know, well, the elephant in the room is indeed the crisis and, you know, what's happening around us and so forth. So, you know, I'll go right, because what we'll do, I'll start with some of my questions. Then there are already some questions which have been asked by the participants before, and then we will also hopefully have time for live questions from the audience.
Great.
So I'll just start with a very practical question, you know. If you were again a young manager in this context, you know, what advice would you give? What to do, what not to do? Which are the main things to be done in a crisis like this?
Well, I think where I would go for the advice that I would give, and in fact have been giving to the different organizations I work with. I work with formally 10 different organizations at the moment, and continue to add additional ones over time. And many of those are small, fast-growing firms in the information services field, which is where I spent most of my career. And several of them are very much in the middle of this crisis and suffering a lot through it. And so some of the advice that I've given has been based on what I learned, both what I learned from what I did well in previous crises, as well as things that I didn't do so well in previous crises. But I was able to learn from both of those things. And in some cases say, hey, do this because it did work, and don't do this because it definitely wasn't the right thing to do. And where I really focus my thoughts when people ask for thoughts in terms of how best to manage through this crisis, I'll give you two main areas. You can go for a long list, but for me, there are two things that I find to be especially helpful, especially valuable. The first one's pretty obvious. The second one I find not so obvious. So let me start with the obvious one, which is the importance of communication. From a leader's perspective, I think you all would agree that when you're in the midst of a crisis, it's unsettling, it's destabilizing. That is, in fact, the clinical definition of a crisis. It's a point of destabilization, right? Mm-hmm. Destabilization. And when you're in that environment, when you're in that moment, communication becomes even more important than it is when everything is fine. It's pretty important even when everything is fine, but it is so much more important in the midst of a crisis. And so from a leader's perspective, communicating with reliability and communicating to drive clarity are the two key things that I suggest. You cannot communicate with certainty. It's not always a good idea to be 100% transparent. There are some things that are better held back. But what you can be is crystal clear in your messages. And sometimes that is difficult to do because you don't have 100% certainty about where you are and what's going to happen. But you can be really clear about how you want everybody to respond in the moment. And the second thing is to be as reliable as you possibly can. In other words, you say, I'm going to come before you every week with an update, or every 2 weeks with an update, or I'm going to write this and we're going to do an all staff, all hands town hall type gathering once a month. If you say you're going to do that, you need to be reliable and do it. You need to follow through on doing it. And what happens in the middle of a crisis is sometimes there's so much bad news that you'll want to say, we don't have time for that right now, because you don't want to share the bad news. And what will happen when you don't follow through with that reliable, steady, consistent communication is people will fill in the void. And they'll fill in the void almost always with a worse perspective than the one you would have shared. So you have to be crystal clear, and you have to be as reliable as you can possibly muster the strength to do. And I know how difficult it is, but to me, this is one of the most basic and most important things a leader can do when you're in the middle of a crisis. Now, my guess is most of you already know all that, so all I did was remind you of what you already know, but that's a lot of what leadership training is all about, is being reminded of important things. Here's the second thing, though, that maybe isn't quite so obvious and maybe isn't something that you've already thought of, which is what I'll call the fundamentals. This is what I've learned in previous crises. A lot of external factors come and your business gets hit, and you start to miss your financial numbers, your revenue targets, your profit targets. You miss them in the current month, you miss them for the current quarter. And in some cases, when the crisis is severe, you miss them by so much that you realize at some point you have no chance of meeting your operating targets for the full year. So those reliable metrics, those output metrics that give you the good guidance from a business perspective are no longer good guides at all. When your financials become wrecked, then what do you do in order to still know that you're focusing on the right things, you're still on the right track? And more importantly, what are the metrics that you point to for the rest of your team to tell them we're still making progress? Despite what you see in the financials, we're still doing the right things, we're still on track. And that's where you go to what I call the fundamentals. So the financials are kind of an output metric. It tells you the outcomes that you've achieved. The fundamentals are more about the input side of the equation. You can control those, even in a crisis. You can continue to contact clients on a regular basis. You can continue to make sure your managers are doing their job as good people managers. You can continue to make sure that you are hitting your timelines on the key development initiatives that are important for the future of your business. All of those kinds of things on the input side of the equation. So that's the most important thing I would suggest a leader do in the midst of a crisis, is focus on the input side, because no longer will you be able to use the output side of the equation as a reliable barometer. Focus on the input side, double down on those measurements, and use those as the basis for your communication to your staff to say, despite everything that's going on outside, we're still delivering and doing the right things on the inside. And as a result of that, we will emerge sooner and we will emerge stronger from this crisis. than our competitors will, and than we otherwise would if we didn't have this kind of intense focus right now. That served me really well in a previous crisis, and I think it'll serve people well in the midst of this crisis as well, Daniel.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's really great to hear what you're saying, because I'm sure many of us do some of these things, instinctively. But hearing the theory behind, I think is really great, also to fine tune the approach, because indeed, coming back to the numbers, financials are a lagging indicator. If you just look at the numbers, by the time the numbers get to you, it's too late and you're like 2 months behind. So yeah, this is, and I've seen a feedback. I think it's really brilliant what you just said, because you should focus on what you can control, not on what you cannot control. But coming back to the first part of the question, is there a danger to ever over communicate in a crisis? I mean, do you think we could ever over communicate? Because in my case, I've set a rhythm of communicating with the whole company. Now, I'm not sure, is it too often or not enough, but can you go overboard in saying things too often to people?
Well, this is a philosophical question, and I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer, but I'll share my philosophy. I don't think the risk is to communicate too much in terms of volume of communication. Mm-hmm. There is a risk of communicating the wrong kinds of messages, though. Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer in the value of transparency in business, but transparency is not a license to just dump everything on everybody who, in some cases, don't have the context to interpret that information in a way that allows them to use it productively and in a healthy manner. You as a leader tend to have access to more information than everybody else. Mm-hmm. You have more context than most other people do. You also have generally more experience than most people do. So you should be more able to digest and to process and to bear the burden of all that knowledge that all that information brings to you. It can be a mistake to assume everybody else in your organization has all that too. So I think you have to use good judgment in terms of what you share with people. It's not a time to just say, hey, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. Leadership is not about being brutal. Leadership is about finding the right level of information, what people need to know in the form that they can best take it in, mm-hmm. that allows them to know where they stand, what they need to do next in order to help themselves and to help the organization. So to me, it's the volume of communication, the reliability of the communication. I think more is generally better, but you still have to exercise a lot of judgment in terms of what the messages are, what the content is. And that's always a tricky thing to do. And, but usually that's really clear in retrospect. On the other side of the crisis, you look back and say, I guess I went too far on that one message. So, really the best gauge for me in the end is you look in the mirror every morning, you ask yourself, are my motives in the right place? Do I have the right intentions about what I'm doing? Am I communicating things because I think it's the right thing for the team to hear, or am I communicating these messages because my self-interests are really what's most important to me? Mm-hmm. If your motives are in the right place, you go forward, you're going to end up on the right side of the line more often than not, I think.
Okay, very nice. Thank you. Second question. There's always a relationship between our personal and our professional lives, between how we do as people and how we do in the business. And what I've seen happen is sometimes when you're in a crisis professionally, that can trigger a crisis personally, and vice versa. When we're not doing well personally, it can affect our performance in the business world. So, and at some point I've seen that these kind of crises can feed on each other and really impact us, so that people can get in a kind of a spiral, in a loop. What's your advice regarding how to avoid that kind of situation? Where do you stop it? At what do you stop it professionally? Do you stop it personally first? How do you balance yourself? And I remember you had a great story about balance last time we talked. I'm just thinking in terms of a crisis, how do you apply the balance principle?
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of these things I'll call leadership paradoxes. And this is another another example of where I think a leadership paradox comes into play, and it can be kind of helpful. So you mentioned that there's the personal side of this, and then there's the organization side of this. So, how do you respond? And the answer is where the paradox lies. On the personal side of it, I think it's really important for people to increase the focus on themselves. On the organizational side of it, it's really important that leaders don't focus on themselves. So on the one hand, I'm going to say, increase the focus on yourself. On the organization side, I'm going to say, don't focus on yourself, focus on everybody else. What I mean by the personal side, to focus on yourself, is this is the time, yes, to practice balance even better than you normally might need to, meaning you have to be even more diligent and disciplined about getting rest, eating well, having people that you care about and that you love and who love you and care about you around you, so that you have those healthy personal relationships that support you and speak into your motives and can keep an eye on you. If you're not well, sometimes we're the last to know when we're not doing well. So you need to double down on all those things, the things that fill your tank of energy that ultimately your organization is going to need you to draw from to do what they need the leader to do. And in a crisis, that tank is going to get drawn from faster. And so you need to fill that tank faster in order to maintain sufficient reserves to be able to do your job well. That is incredibly important. And that's why I say, in the midst of a crisis, you really do need to increase your focus on yourself, meaning your personal well-being, which is the key enabler for you to provide the kind of leadership that your business, that your team need. Now, when you turn and face that team, when you turn and focus to that business, a crisis a lot of times can put your self-interest at risk. Maybe your bonus, your stock awards, if you have stock in your compensation package, all of those look very much in jeopardy in the midst of a crisis. Your status in the social circles in which you travel may be at risk. It can be a big temptation to start to really think about all of the losses that you're suffering, all the risk that is now materializing in front of you, and really start to have your self-interest take precedent over the interests of your organization, over the interests of your team. And this is something that I'll tell you is a very natural and human response. And if you succumb to it, I can almost guarantee you'll regret it. So it's really crucial that you resist the temptation to put yourself first when it comes time to face into your organization and your team. And if you can do that, you're going to get to the other side of this, and you're going to be able to feel really good about how you managed through it. People are going to see you in a different and better way as a leader, because they're going to know how difficult that period was. Everybody understands the extra burden that the leader of the team and the organization has. You will in the end see the payoff for yourself. That's not the reason to do it, but it still remains true. So don't focus on yourself when it comes time to focus on the organization. Do focus on yourself when it comes time to make sure you're taking care of yourself and your ability to be of service to the team who's counting on you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. One more question about crises. Because we're in a situation where I think most of the companies are affected negatively by this crisis. There are some for which the crisis is an opportunity, but for most organizations, it's a difficult moment. So the question is, can you avoid crisis, both in the business world and elsewhere? Is there a way to get away from the risk of being in a crisis?
I'd say no. Can you avoid crises? No. Can you predict them? Generally, no. Can you expect them? In other words, I think you should expect crises, even though you can't predict them. Mm-hmm. Can you prepare for crises? That's really, to me, the most important question. Mm-hmm. And the answer to that is, of course, yes. There's a great book by Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great. A later book he wrote, which at least in the US has a blue cover. Good to Great tends to have the red cover in most countries where I've seen it around the world. but his blue book was called Great by Choice. And one of the key premises in the book is that what differentiates great leadership versus less than great leadership over the long run is not the circumstances that happen to us, but it's our preparation for those circumstances. And he said that in the book, the research shows that, yeah, bad things will happen to almost everybody eventually. But the people who have prepared for the unexpected bad things to happen are the ones who ultimately see it through. And in fact, the bad things should not be unexpected. Just because they are currently unknown, just because they're currently not visible, you should expect them to be somewhere in the path that you're on down the road. You should expect them to happen anyway. And you should already be preparing for them so that when you do finally encounter them, you'll be better prepared than your competitor. You'll be better prepared than you otherwise would, more likely to be able to see it through. So I think that's about the best we can do when it comes to crises.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to honor the people who have sent questions ahead of the meeting. So I'll pick a couple of those questions, and then I will go to questions that we'll receive live here, and maybe add a few more. And we have one question from Bogdan. How do you spot an opportunity in times of crisis?
I think the way that that's been most helpful to me over the years is I always think in terms of there's a triangle. There's a triangle. I wish I had a graphic of this, but I don't. But let me describe it to you. Think of the triangle with 3 points. One point is, what are your resources that you have? In other words, how much cash, how much capacity do you have? You have to have an assessment of that. The second is, what is the client situation or the marketplace situation in which you operate? And the third is, how are your competitors situated? So if you have those 3 points on the triangle clear in your head and you have an assessment of those, then to me, you'll be able to judge whether or not something is an opportunity in front of you that you should pursue. Because if your competitor is not as well positioned as you are, if it's a real opportunity or need in terms of what your client or the marketplace is asking for, and you have the resources to be able to pursue it, then those are the elements in the equation that I would consider in terms of whether that's an opportunity that you should go for, even in the midst of a crisis. A lot of times in the midst of a crisis, here's what I find happens. My competitors, they curl up into a fetal position and retreat into a bunker, understandably. Or they start to cut and slash costs, and they actually take away the capacity that would enable them to pursue a client opportunity in the marketplace. Or maybe they just haven't been running their business in a lean way, and so they don't have the extra capacity, the reserves, the cash required to go after the opportunity. So if you've done all those things differently than your competitor and your client has a need, that's when the opportunity is a really ripe one to go for.
Okay, thank you. I think this crisis is a huge experiment in the work from home concept, which many companies resisted. And now the crisis has proven basically that it can work. And I don't think it can work in any conditions, but obviously it can work. And we have a question from Diana, which is, what is the most important skill that we should train in order to adapt and lead in the new world, which is a world of hybrid remote office work?
Well, I think this highlights what is a skill even in normal times that is increasing in value in the world today because of so many forces, technology-driven forces in most cases. But the basic skill that's even more important right now is this idea of call it resourcefulness. It's the ability, even in the middle of your career, even at a later stage in your career, like I am, Daniel, old guy, that you still have the capacity to learn new things. In fact, not just the ability to learn new things, but the energy, the excitement, the curiosity to be compelled to want to learn new things. That's just an incredibly important thing. To some degree, that's a skill. But to a more important degree, I think it's a mindset. I think everybody can do it. Usually the bigger barrier, rather than the skill, the ability to learn, is the mentality. and especially as we get deeper in our careers, one of the risks we all fall prey to is, okay, I've worked really hard for the past 10 or 15 years. Now I have a position of authority, and you don't want to continue to do the hard work that learning about a new area requires, because learning is a grind. It takes a lot from you. It asks a lot of you to learn a whole new skill set. In many cases, you not only have to learn new information, you have to put yourself out there and to try something new, which of course exposes you to the risk of failure. Or you have to put yourself out there and eventually express your newfound knowledge, which of course exposes you to somebody saying, no, that's not right. So, we remember it from when we're young, the whole learning process. But to me, this is the best defense against change, even in the middle or even in the later stage of our careers, and definitely in times of crises, is that resourcefulness, that ongoing ability to learn, even being compelled and enjoying that continued learning process, almost seeking out those new areas, because the world's changing at a fast pace, and that you need to change at least as fast as the world around you, or else you're left behind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Actually, I'm not sure if everybody knows, you're also on the board of Global Leadership Network. And one of the things I learned at one of the conferences was exactly this, that if you want to stay young, try to learn one new thing every year. Because to stay young, you either need to learn yourself or to pass on your knowledge to other younger people, or beginner or more beginner than you are, because that's something which keeps you really sharp and fresh all the time. So
yeah,
great.
It definitely does.
Yeah. Okay, one question from Christina. What helps you discern and find your leadership voice that communicates clearly to the people?
Say it again, Daniel, please.
So what helps you discern and find your leadership voice that communicates clearly to people?
Yeah, my leadership voice. Okay, so I'm probably pretty old school in this way, and so what I'm going to say, I'm going to guess is not going to be popular, but maybe, just maybe, somebody will take me up on it. I still like to write things down. Like I still like to write a memo when I'm going to communicate something that I think is really important to a group of people. Maybe it's a big group, maybe it's a small group. I still like to take the time to write it down in old-fashioned prose, sentences with punctuation and paragraphs and proper grammar and everything. And a lot of times I'll write it down and I'll never use it again. I'll just write it down. It's a way for me to organize my thoughts. It's a way for me to check for myself that, yeah, I do in fact know what it is that I want to say, and I can say it well. And then after I've written it down, a lot of times I just take that piece of paper and set it aside, turn it upside down. I don't go back to it and read it, in other words, to the group. But what it does is it allows me to clarify my thinking. It allows me to find that voice. Yeah, that'd be the right word now. And then I say it in a way verbally. I say it in a way personally that I think is going to be the most compelling, the most engaging, the most impactful. That to me is the skill I have. So if I have the time, that's what I would do. If I don't have the time, then I'm just saying to myself, all right, like say if I don't have time to write it down and I'm looking out at a group of people and I have to come up with it on the spot, what I tend to do is look out at the crowd of people, but I don't see the crowd. What I try to see in my mind is that one person that I want to mentor, or that one person who I'm actually trying to hire to come into my company right now, knowing everything that they need to know about what we're in the middle of. So I'm going to try to communicate this message in a way that will be right for that person I really care about that I mentor, or right for that person that I really want to decide to join our company. That doesn't mean I'm selling. In fact, it means I'm trying to communicate the fundamental truths, the brutal facts in some cases, but also with a sense of optimism about where we're going to go next, what the future is going to look like, despite these difficult circumstances that we find ourselves in the middle of right now. So you buy credibility by being honest about the current situation, but then you're trying to put on top of that the layer of inspiration, passion, that optimism for the future really brings to the party. And not just optimism in terms of, shiny gloss, but it's optimism because you're saying, here's where we're going to be in the future. And here's why I believe that can happen. Here's why, or here's how that is going to become true. And if I can communicate to that one person I'm trying to mentor, that one person I'm trying to hire in a much bigger crowd, I do a much better job than if I'm just speaking in the abstract to a large group of people.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Another question from Andrew. How do you define success? And the second one, what is happiness for you?
How do I define success? I guess that's sort of in general, or is that through a crisis moment?
I think in general, but maybe the crisis makes it even more clear sometimes.
One thing I've, on the success question, one thing I've spent a lot of time reading about over the last several months. In fact, I think I even briefly touched on this when I was in Romania back in January, is success is a tricky thing because such a big component of success involves luck. It involves random events that we have to contend with as leaders in the business world. I think luck plays a far bigger role than many people are aware when it comes to business outcomes, or even if they are aware, luck plays a far bigger role than many people are willing to acknowledge. So I'm not one of those people that say, hey, this is a 100% meritocracy system. I don't think that that's the right way to think about success in the world. In other words, you're only successful if you've made the right decisions. And if you make the right decisions, you will be successful. I don't think that necessarily is true, because I think you can make all the right decisions. And in some cases, circumstances will intervene and your outcomes won't be positive still. That is, in fact, what the data suggest is true about most aspects of life, including business life. So I don't define my success so much by just the outcomes. Of course, the world's going to judge us based on our outcomes, and I'm not going to be somebody who pretends outcomes don't matter. That's not it. But I'm much more concerned about the input side of the equation. Kind of goes back to what we talked before about fundamentals. In other words, I'm gonna be content with whatever happens on the output side if I can look at myself in the mirror and say, my motives stayed where they needed to be. I operated with integrity. The quality of my decisions was extremely high. Not say I wouldn't do some things differently based on learning after the fact, but I made the best possible decisions with the information I had at the time. If I feel good about that, and if I can say those things, then I consider that success, right? Because those are really hard to do. Yeah. Those are really hard to do, to operate with integrity, to make high quality decisions. And by the way, I guess I didn't add, did I work as hard as I possibly could? There was a janitor at the junior high school that I went to, 7th grade. So I'm 12 years old maybe. But there was a janitor, his name was Carl Haverkamp. And Carl was this strange looking guy, would lean on his broom all the time. You'd walk down the hall and sometimes he would see one of the kids, maybe me, kind of looking a little bit down that day. And like one day I remember when I was in the 7th grade, I'm walking down the hall and I was definitely down. Carl said, "Hey, what's wrong?" I said, "Well, we just lost our basketball game." And Carl's line was always, "Hey, all you can do is all you can do." And it sounds like such a simple little thing, but there's a lot of wisdom baked into that simple little statement. You know, if you look in the mirror and ask yourself, did I do all that I can do? If so, then you just rest in that peace. And by the way, it's a very tall order, and we all know that we often leave at least a little bit behind, and you can always give a little bit more.
Yeah, well, because we talked about that, to just put it in context, many people say that this is the crisis of our generation, of our century, that we've never been through something as big as this one since the Great Depression. So I'm just curious, this is just a thought that, just to put in context what's happening to us, do you also feel this is like a unique crisis? I mean, it's not the regular one every 8-9 years, but rather like a century level crisis, or how do you see that?
Yeah, I do. I suspect this is something that we're all going to think about for the rest of our lives. That it'll be, written about even long after we're all gone from this earth. And so one of the things I have tried to do is not only, navigate in the best way I can on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis as this crisis continues to unfold, but also occasionally to step back and see it in as much as I can anyway in a historical context. I've said to myself, I should be taking pictures of things that are unique to this time. I should try to document moments along this time, almost keep a diary is one way to think about it, so that I'll be able to look back on, how was I feeling? What was I doing? What did it look like? What did it feel like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And one of the things I've done to try to help me do that in the best way possible is I've gone down into my basement here at our home where we live in the United States, and I've opened up some boxes from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, all the way back to when I was in university, which is a long time ago, just to try to remind myself, oh yeah, what does a moment look like 20 years later, 30 years later? What are the things that you save that I wished I would have saved in order to recall or to remember that moment in the best way, most useful way possible, not only for myself, but for my kids who will open up these boxes again someday. So that's the biggest thing that I've done based on my learning, and how I've drawn from that learning, opening up boxes from previous crises. Yeah.
Wow, very nice. Well, to be honest, all I could think for myself was to start a diary in this time, which I did, which is something new for me as well. But I haven't thought of doing even more, and that is to really collect things from this time to be able to look back 10, 20 years from now. So that's a great perspective. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. As promised, I'm starting to take some questions which are being sent live. So for our audience, they can send us live on Zoom as well as on Facebook questions. I'll start with a question which we got here on Zoom.
Daniel, if I may,
please.
Can I just inject something to go back to one of your previous questions?
Oh, please.
You asked in one of the earlier questions about what advice would you give to a younger leader who's navigating this crisis right now?
Yeah.
And maybe this would come up in a question somebody would ask, but I do have one thing that I had thought about in advance, and it probably fits better with that question.
That's great.
And I'll share something on the screen in just a moment for all of you out there. There's a model called the J curve. But let me set it up, first of all, by referring to an article that was written back in 2011 by Ben Horowitz. And if some of you probably heard of this article, it's about peacetime CEO versus wartime CEO is the title of the article. And Ben Horowitz is, he's one of the names associated with Andreessen Horowitz, the famed Silicon Valley venture capital firm. And he wrote this article back in 2011 about when a CEO needs to be a peacetime CEO versus a wartime CEO, and how important a model that is. And that's gotten a lot of attention in the middle of this crisis right now. I would guess that some of you have heard of this, at least this reference, this phrase, peacetime CEO, wartime CEO, maybe even read this article. I personally think this gets way too much attention. And I think it can be actually helpful a little bit, but also very dangerous if carried too far. The world is not as simple as binary peacetime, wartime CEO models. Most of effective leadership, of course, lives in the middle of that continuum, even in the middle of a crisis like this. And I don't think you really ever choose to be at war. War is, it's the last thing you want to do if you're doing it in the right way. So it's never a choice that you'd want to make. It's the only choice you have left. And I don't think that's where most of us are from a business perspective. So I think it's really dangerous to go all the way to the wartime side of it. And there's a model that I think can be helpful. I'll share my screen here that explains why. And this is the J curve. So you should be seeing it on your screen now, this thing called the J curve. And what it does is it has two dimensions: stability on the vertical axis and openness on the horizontal axis. So you have some companies that they're not very open. They're over here. They're not very open. In other words, they're very tightly centrally controlled. And by doing so, they have a healthy degree of stability, but of course, not much openness. You have other companies that are on this part of the curve over here. They operate in a much more open manner. That means they're more agile. They're probably more innovative. They probably are more enjoyable places to work over here. And they also, they also have a lot of stability, but it's a cultural stability rather than a command and control type of stability. So that's your J curve right here. And every company, every country for that matter, can be mapped somewhere along this curve. And the originator of this graphic, the Eurasia Group, and Ian Bremmer in particular at the Eurasia Group, has in fact produced charts that map countries, industries on this curve. And you can look that up online. I think you'll find it to be very interesting. So that's that. Now, here's what happens. Let me go to a slightly different version of this and share it. Yeah, here's what happens. In a crisis, basically a crisis throws every company to the bottom part of the J curve down here, a crisis state. If you started up here, a crisis will throw you down there. If you started over here, a crisis will throw you down here. What the peacetime, wartime CEO model says is when you're in a crisis, it says, become a wartime CEO. In other words, reduce openness, be more command and control, and by doing so, you'll increase stability. And by the way, that's probably true. And so at least in the short term, that might be good advice. But here's the problem. After you're on the other side of the crisis, then you're a wartime CEO who is operating in a command and control manner. How do you get back over here to the other side of the curve? Well, unfortunately, the only way to get back over here where you wanted to be long-term is you have to go back through the curve. You cannot skip over the gap. You have to go back down here and impose instability on your own organization in order to then move back up the other side of the curve. So this to me is the big danger in this pandemic that we're in right now, is what companies are succumbing to this advice or temptation to impose wartime CEO practices on their company. And even though while in the short run that might prove to be beneficial, they have a problem waiting for them on the other side of the pandemic, which is how to get back to a healthier, more attractive culture and mode of operating, if in fact that's where you want to be long-term. Not everybody wants to be there long-term, but for me, this is where I want to work. For me, this is the kind of organization I want to lead. This is the part of the curve I always want to be moving up on right here. So I wanted to just share that because that's another piece of advice, a little bit more granular, a little bit more in the weeds detail that I would talk through with a younger leader, frankly, any leader of any organization, in terms of how they might choose to respond to this crisis, if that makes sense, Daniel.
Well, thank you very much, Mitch. And I have to be honest here, this strikes very close to home for me because, and just to be honest about it, we haven't aligned on this before. So it's not like I know what you were going to say. I didn't even know you were going to present this. And I actually have used the parallel without knowing the article you referred to. I use the parallel in a different way. And that is, when you happen to be in command and the war comes, of course, none of us wants the war. So none of us wants the crisis. All of us hate the crisis, basically. But still, I think it's an honor to lead during a war if fate has put you there at that time. But of course, the question is, how do you lead? It's an honor to be able to influence, but the question is, how do you lead? So thank you so much for this advice. We appreciate it. And we have a personal question from Marius, who's asking, what is the most important lesson you learned during the past crisis, both personal and professional lesson, I guess?
Well, the last big crisis that I was leading a business through was the global financial crisis back in 2007, 8, 9, that time frame. I was based in Shanghai in China at the time. So it wasn't the worst place to be in the world, frankly, during the global financial crisis, because China, here's what a crisis looked like in China while I was there. We went from 26% growth in 2008 as the crisis was still developing, and then we declined to 6.5% growth in 2009. Not too bad, right? Not too bad.
Not too bad, no.
But it felt horrible. Felt horrible to me at the time to see our growth rate plummet so much. But I know that a lot of businesses in other parts of the world were, of course, seeing negative revenue trends, and so it was a very difficult period. What I learned through that, though, was what I shared to some degree, which was we just focused on the fundamentals. And what we said was, all right, we're probably not going to hit our 20% plus growth rate. We can gain market share, though, because all of our competitors are going to retreat into a bunker. They're going to curl up into a fetal position. They're not as well prepared as we are. They don't have the confidence that we do. So when they retreat, we will move forward. And we will continue to invest in the key client relationships. We will, in fact, go to the client and say, you might need help right now. Your budgets might be under pressure right now. How can we help you? Can we maybe reduce the fees you're paying to us right now? And in return, you just give us an extra year on the end of the 3-year contract. So it becomes a 4-year contract. And the client said, oh, fantastic. I love that. Well, we could afford to do that because we were operating in a lean, healthy way. We had some reserve, and our competitors didn't. They had to go slash staff, slash budgets. And, so again, getting back to the fundamentals, and taking advantage of whatever opportunity that you're in position to take advantage of, and do it with some confidence. That's the key thing I learned. So that helps me not only to know how to operate within a crisis the next time it emerges, but it also tells me how I should be preparing for that next crisis, even though I have no idea when it's going to happen, just as we had talked before. Yep. Only thing I know is that it's almost inevitable that another crisis will happen. I just don't know when. I don't know what it'll look like, but I can be pretty sure another one's coming. So I might as well prepare for it and take advantage of it to the degree that I can, and of course, to the degree my competitor can.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question from Facebook from a guy who is wondering, from George, if it's a good moment to start a business in this context. Because it surely doesn't look like a good moment, but how do you see it? Would you start a business in a crisis?
What business? What business? I mean, there are probably some businesses where this might not be a bad time at all to start a business in a crisis if you have the resources to do it. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is I work with a couple of companies right now that are focused on the e-commerce world in a couple of different ways. They're doing well. Why? Because a lot of consumers who had otherwise bought most of their stuff in brick and mortar stores are now, of course, increasing the amount that they purchase online. And these companies are betting that, all right, this is a change in consumer behavior in the middle of the crisis. At least some of that change in consumer behavior will remain even post-crisis. So a lot of the clients of these small firms I work with are doubling down on their investments to shore up the ROI of different elements of their website, their supply chain to support e-commerce purchasing. And then that's driving a lot of needs for information, data, analytics related to e-commerce purchasing. So if you're doing something in that space, then that would be an example. And I'm sure there are other examples. That would be an example of something that's very much on trend. The key thing would be to evaluate, is it just something that is increasing right now because of the pandemic? Or is the pandemic simply accelerating what already would have eventually happened 2 or 3 years down the road, but now it's happening in 2 or 3 months' time? That's what I think is happening in the e-commerce world, is we're seeing a shift in purchasing that would have happened anyway. It would have just taken longer. So these guys are smart by doubling down on their investments right now. And if you can see other opportunities in the marketplace that have those same characteristics, then it might be a good time to start a business if it's focused on the right thing.
But I think I happen to know a bit of the context, so I will rephrase the question. Would you start a business in a sector which seems to be affected by the crisis? I mean, let's say car industry or another, or well, car sales or travel or holidays and so forth. Would you be considering something like that now?
I don't know. Maybe I would buy one of those businesses because I think that I may be able to get an incredible value on somebody that needs to run away. That may be a better way to start a business, is actually to buy your way in from somebody who needs a liquidity event, or else they're going to go bankrupt.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's interesting. Another question, I think, is more like a remark also from Facebook about your J image, J curve, that it can also be transferred in a national level where you see an increase of laws and power imposed by local and national authorities. And I know that there's a big debate in the US about that. How do you see that? Will we be able to transition back to a more flexible society afterwards, or is this here to stay?
Well, in fact, the J curve is originally from the Eurasia Group and Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer is a political scientist. He originally developed that model to explain the way different governments of different nations were operating. But I find it has also application to the corporate world. There are a lot of similarities. And so, I think the observation is exactly right. You'll in fact see it online more in reference to how governments operate and what the culture of the government is in different countries around the world. And right now, I think what Ian Bremmer would say, because I read a lot of his material from Eurasia Group, what he would say is there is a shift, gradual and consistent shift right now towards nationalism and, and away from globalization. And so it not only shifts the position of certain countries on that J curve model, but it's also shifting where the curve is in the inside the graph, and to some degree even the shape of the curve. Of course, it's all theoretical, so you got to read all the context around it, but I think the observation is a very good one and exactly right.
And maybe staying on that point, because what we've seen here, recently, is kind of a pushback against globalization and against even trade with some countries based on their response and transparency regarding the crisis. So how do you think this is going to shape, the new world? What's the impact that is going to have in the way we trade, the way we travel, and so forth on a global scale? Let's say after the epidemic is over, what do you think will be the impact there?
Well, shape is a really good word that you use there. I think it will reshape what globalization looks like. And in some degree, globalization will slow. It may even retreat temporarily, but I don't think it retreats thoroughly. That's not what I would expect. I don't think that's what Ian Bremmer from Eurasia Group would say. I don't think that's what many experts would say. But it is being impacted significantly by the political trends. But there's a really powerful force on the other side, which is called profit margin. And one of the reasons why globalization was so attractive to begin with is because it results in tremendous efficiencies for the marketplace. Those efficiencies are incredibly important to businesses in almost every sector. And businesses are not going to quickly trade in those efficiencies. What they may do is say, all right, we want to continue to be efficient, but right now we're highly efficient, but also excessively dependent on a certain nation for our supply chain. So what we need to do now is reshape that supply chain so that we're not excessively dependent on just this one country, and instead spread it out a little bit, but try to do so in such a way that doesn't sacrifice too much of the efficiency. And some of that was already happening anyway. As wages would go up in China, people were already moving some of their supply chain to Vietnam or to other neighboring countries in Southeast Asia. But now people are going to do that just simply to de-risk the supply chain. Security of supply is, of course, one of the fundamental principles in business management, operations management. And what we're finding right now, security of supply is unsatisfactory. for a lot of businesses. So they will figure out how to reshape it, to reshape it, but to try to do so in a way that it doesn't sacrifice very much efficiency, and maybe even long-term makes them more agile over time. And I think that's what I would really expect to happen. Governments are going to continue to pound away on one side, and nationalism will continue, I think, to grow steadily. That'd be my guess anyway. But the corporations still have the pressure on the other side, which is the profit margin. And that's why I think it will stay at some dynamic equilibrium is probably the best way to think about it. It's not equilibrium as in nothing is changing. There's a ton changing. It's a reshaping of it. But if you start to see margins contract on a broad scale, then you'll know everything I've just said is wrong, that globalization is being reversed. But I think what you'll find is they're not going to contract on a broad scale, but there's a lot happening underneath in order to respond to the nationalism pressures, to de-risk supply chain, and yet still protect the margins.
Okay. We're getting a question, which is a reference to your earlier answer about the J-curve. And the question is basically, why do you need to go through a crisis to get back on the upward right side trend? Why is that? Can't you adapt your management style to be different? Can't you just avoid the crisis? So if you want to move from a wartime CEO to a peacetime CEO, is there a crisis to cross and can't you avoid it?
The bottom of the J-curve, it doesn't mean crisis. The bottom of the J-curve just means you're going to have to go through periods of lower stability as you move from, this side of the curve in order to go back to that side of the curve. In other words, You cannot skip over. That's the theory. You have to destabilize, because when you release command and control, the very nature of releasing command and control authority will temporarily be destabilizing. Okay. And then you need to have the organization start to take on more local autonomy, more local responsibility in order to move back up the other side of the curve. So it doesn't require you to go back through a crisis, but it'll feel like a crisis as you try to, let go of the temporary wartime CEO mentality in order to get back to a much friendlier peacetime CEO model.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, do you think a CEO can change his style? Because we've heard, or at least I've read about turnaround CEOs and growth CEOs, and it looks like some people are, well suited for more turnaround challenges, while others are more long-term builders. So how do you see that?
Some can, some can't. Yeah, some can, some can't. I think that's one of the great things that search firms look for. They'll call it mental agility or situational leadership ability, these kinds of things. If you've done, if you've gone through search processes with some of these world-class search firms, they'll almost always eventually put you through some questionnaire, personality profiling questionnaire. And often what they're trying to get at is exactly this, which is, do you have just one leadership mode, one leadership model, or do you have the ability to adjust your style of leadership across multiple situations? And I've even had one recruiter one time say, what we're looking for is somebody who has been able to demonstrate successful, effective leadership across many different situations, not somebody who's just been successful over and over again within the same environment. So what they were saying in essence is, we like people who have been at different companies and have been in different kinds of businesses and have worked in different economic cycles and have somehow managed to navigate through all of those, because that's the person who will have the lowest level of risk for whatever comes next, since nobody knows what's going to come next.
Okay. We have a group of questions which refer to decisions that you need to take in a company during a crisis. And I will not read all the questions, but many of them have the same idea behind them. And that is, how do you choose, how do you preserve capital versus keeping the entire team? How do you innovate in a crisis, or even what kind of partnerships do you make in a crisis in terms of win-win partnerships in order to make sure that both sides survive? So I think these are more on strategy part. What kind of advice would you give to this kind of questions now?
Yeah, I'll pick up on the one that mentions partnerships and win-win. I'm not a big fan of the win-win language, but I am a big fan of that idea. The business philosophy, if you will, that I'm a big fan of is what I'll call non-zero sum thinking. A lot of, most of life and most of business situations, they are in fact zero sum. Don't deny that. Where if one person wins, that means somebody else lost, and the overall market, stays about the same. Just one side, A has a little more, B has a little less, but the overall market is the same. Most of life is like that. But there are occasional moments where it's a non-zero sum situation. In other words, you can operate in such a way where you move a step ahead, and you do so in a way that doesn't 100% come at somebody else's expense. The overall system gets a little bigger, a little better as a result of the way you operate. And usually that happens through some type of collaboration or partnership. And in fact, there's a book called Non-Zero by Robert Wright, and he says most of human progress over the long arc of history has been marked by moments of cooperation when those elements of society otherwise normally would have competed with one another. But for whatever reason, at that particular moment, they decided, instead of beating each other up, let's try to figure out a way to work together and move forward. Maybe it's because they are competitors who decided not to compete. Maybe it's because they are partners who previously did not work together. It can be either one, but this to me is a really key thing. So Non-Zero is one book that talks about this. There's another book that's behind me here called Friend and Foe, which is about the same basic idea, a little bit more reader friendly. But I think that's a great thing to look for in these environments, because everybody is destabilized in a crisis. Everybody, therefore, they're forced to be a little bit more open-minded, and they're a little bit more desperate. And their strategies make a little bit less sense right now. And so it can be a great time to, pick up the phone, get in touch with your competitor, and you have to do it legally. I'm not saying do anything illegally, but get in touch with your competitor. If nothing else, just say, how you doing? And you may find that there is a moment that you're in the middle of where you can do something together that neither one of you would be able to do by yourself. And you both come out of this a little bit better off. And it can change not only your result for that moment, but it can actually change, relationship that you might have at the corporate or at the personal level over the long run. It's moments like this that I think create those opportunities more easily than, when everything's going well.
Great. Another question, and now it's about colleagues, employees. What is the best opportunity for somebody who is let's say not a CEO, but an employee in a company during a crisis, and how do you motivate them? How do you frame the context in a way that helps motivation?
Daniel, do you mean if I'm a manager inside the organization, how do I talk to the teams?
Yeah.
Is that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Well, it's much the same for the manager as it is for the overall organization leader. I think the key thing, though, I would impress on a manager is, it's true even when things are fine, but it's like most things. A crisis simply magnifies what is already true. Like, the idea of if you've ever gone for an expatriate assignment, you live in a certain country, your company asks you to move to another country and take a new job. And one of the things that you'll get advice on if you ever consider an assignment like this is, how's the strength of your family? Well, if your family is strong, taking an expat assignment will make it stronger. If your family situation is weak, taking an expat assignment will make it weaker. In other words, it doesn't necessarily change what's true. It simply magnifies what is already true. And I think the same thing is true here about a crisis. So a manager, they got to do the same things, but it's just more important to do certain of those things. One of them is make sure people around you, on your team, your colleagues, your peers, make sure everybody is as clear as they can be about how what they do, what the company is expecting that particular person in that particular role to do. Make sure they understand how that connects to the bigger picture of the organization. People are desperate for this, even in good times, but it's absolutely critical in a time of a crisis where I understand how my role contributes to the goal of this team and how the work of this team contributes to the mission of the organization. When people can see that line and those connections, they will put more energy, have more clarity, more focus, more willingness to sacrifice in doing their particular part of the job than they otherwise would if they don't know how those connections are made. Because they'll know with a more certainty that what they do matters. If I don't know how what I do contributes to the mission of the team and how the mission of the team contributes to the mission of the organization, then I'm not sure what I do matters. And if I'm not sure how what I do matters, I'm not sure I'm willing to sacrifice. And when you're in the middle of a crisis, that's when you need people to be willing to step forward and sacrifice a little bit. Not a lot. We're not asking, overly burdensome, but yeah, a little bit for sure. And so having that clarity and that connection in terms of how their role connects to the bigger picture, that's the most important thing a manager can do.
Thank you so much. And we have a topic which keeps coming up. So I will also try to combine here two questions into one, maybe. Is the idea of, which are the most important pillars in crisis self-management? And it's connected to what is the biggest lesson, personal lesson that you've learned in a crisis. So how would you answer any of those or both, ideally?
Give me the first one again.
Yeah, the first one is about self-management in a crisis. How do you do that? And then what you've learned personally in a crisis.
Yeah, self-management. Daniel, you're probably a better person to answer this question than me. I'm a strange person, I think it's fair to say. In that, here's why I would say that. I have this belief that the normal condition of life is suffering. So when everything's going well, I feel uneasy. When everything's good, everything's stable, everything's calm, everything's comfortable, I find that very unsettling. When there's a crisis, when there's a lot of problems, a lot of challenges to be faced, then everything sort of becomes clearer to me, because then I know what I'm supposed to do. I know I'm supposed to fix this. I'm supposed to respond to that. And it, in some sense, feels more normal to me. And when everything's good, I get very anxious, and so I don't think I'm a normal person in that sense, and therefore I'm not a very good person to answer this question.
Yeah, but actually, I think I understand what you say. I'm not sure I fully understand, but I've also seen it in my own case. Sometimes when we have an easier period, we can become complacent and then lose track of what's important. So you said it before, a crisis sharpens everything. And also, if we're doing something well, it can sharpen the focus so that we are really focused on what's important, and it can really bring it back into full focus for us.
There's a concept called the paradox of choice. I was talking with somebody yesterday on the phone, and he brought this up, and it kind of fits here too. Paradox of choice says having too many choices can be crippling. Well, what a crisis does is it shrinks your choices, and it says you must do this and this right now. You have no other choice. These things must be dealt with. Maybe that's why I find a crisis to be, in some respects, easier to operate in. When everything's good, then that means I can do anything I want. And then I think, well, okay, I have to make the right choice. And when you have infinite choices, to say I have to choose the right thing is very daunting. But in a crisis, when you really just have the couple of things in front of you that are crystal clear you must do, then somehow it's easier, isn't it? And so if you feel that responsibility, and if that's really what's primary in terms of a motivating force for you as a person. Not everybody's that way, but for me, I think I am. In some ways, crisis simplifies it. Parenthood is also a good model for the same concept. Before my wife and I had children, we had a lot of time. We had a lot of choices that we had to make. And I found that to be sort of intimidating. What should I be doing right now? Then we had children, and I knew exactly what I should be doing. All the other stuff sort of fell aside because I knew that, I had this new life in front of us that I knew that's what I'm supposed to be doing, taking care of that baby. So same kind of thing crisis does. Maybe having a baby is sort of like a crisis. There you go.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, well, we'll take a couple of more. Actually, what we've learned is that these video online sessions can be more tiring in a way than being live in a context. And I think everybody here experienced, a bit of a Zoom burnout in the last 2 months from being too much on. So we'll try to keep it shorter than usual because of that reason. So I will just try one or two more questions for you. Yeah, quite a few to choose from. One of the recent questions is, do you stick to the same 3 company pillars in time of crisis as in time of peace? Like an example is purpose, product, people, or how do you? Do you have a different grid through which you view reality?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have anything wise to say on that. My default would be yes. You don't deviate from your core values, your mission, your purpose in the time of crisis. If anything, you reinforce those things with greater frequency and clarity and conviction. You definitely should reinforce them, but to change them in the midst of a crisis, I don't know that I would suggest doing that, and I certainly can't think of any examples of people who have done that and have lived to tell about it. Yeah, how about that?
Okay, that's good. And I'll just go. Actually, what we plan to do is to have another session like this with Don Lothrop, talking about the big trends and how the world will change. So I'm also using the opportunity to advertise that, and we'll come back with the date on that. But just, how do you see the world will look like in 10 years? Because actually, as the crisis hit, I started reading a book about the Great Depression, and that period was really fundamentally changed within 5 to 10 years. So looking at our world, how do you see the world? How do you see, I don't know, opportunities for Romania, for companies? How will things shift after this crisis? And would you make a prediction how long it will be? Would be very helpful for us to know. Joking.
Yeah, I spent 10 or 15 years of my career in predictive modeling. So I know what a fool's bet that is, to make a prediction for something like this. What I think the world will look like in 5 or 10 years from now, I'm still very positive about the long-term trajectory of the markets and of society. And if we look back over the past 100 years, there have been lots of difficult periods, lots of them. But the general long-term trajectory in the world's been incredibly positive. And I think the forces that underlie that remain there. They're not taken away by this crisis. They'll be altered a little bit, but I would still see, what's happened over the past several decades. We've seen hundreds of millions of people lifted out of abject poverty in some of the biggest countries in the world. And overall, you've seen poverty in the world fall. It doesn't mean there still isn't a huge amount of it. There is. It doesn't mean there's still not lots of need for food and clean water and safety and many other things. There is. But what I'm saying is that the positive trend lines are there, and they're consistent. And I think that they will continue to trend positively even through and after this crisis. So that's one way to think about it. I think another thing that can be said is that the world's made incredible progress from the standpoint of, it sounds like such a boring word, efficiency, but it's just about using the scarce resources that exist in the world in a more efficient manner. There's still tremendous opportunity to do better on that front, in particular with regard to climate. But the positive trend lines are there. And I think that those will continue. I don't think the crisis reverses those trends at all. The big wild card in all of this, of course, is what I'll call government, or also wrapped up in government is what I'll call freedom. And, that's probably the big question is, will that stall? Will that reverse, at least temporarily? And what will be the implications of that? And that's probably the most difficult thing for me to feel optimistic about. I'm not pessimistic about it, though. I wouldn't say that. But I think it's the one that, for me, is the most difficult one to make a guess on and to feel confident about that guess. But overall, I still feel positive. And I think this crisis will be like every other crisis, which is it'll have all kinds of awful things that'll never be taken away or reversed, but there will be silver linings everywhere. And we'll learn from those silver linings, and as a human race and as countries and societies all around the world, we'll use this as a way to learn and get a little bit better and be a little bit better prepared for the next time.
Okay, and really the last question, and this is a direct one, just came in now, so I will use it. You mentioned last time that you're a man of faith, and how does that impact the way you look at the world and you look at the crisis?
Yeah, it's a very important part of it. In that, what I see is a moment when there is, here's the way I think about it. And I even wrote this on LinkedIn, addressing my former company, Nielsen, and all of its 45,000 employees around the world, with this basic idea in mind, which is, as this crisis starts to happen, normal human tendency is you start to think about yourself. How's this affecting me? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to me? And that's natural. And I don't ever look down on anybody for responding that way. I respond that way. But I think the better response, when you take a deep breath and gather yourself, the better response is, what can I do right now? And what I said to my Nielsen colleagues is, this is the moment when you can be a source of hope, a source of poise, a source of help to your clients, to your colleagues, to your family, and to your community. So what compels me to think that way on March 12th, which is when I wrote that and posted it on LinkedIn? It's my faith. Absolutely. It's my faith, because I said to myself, dear God, I think I know what's happening, at least a little bit. And wow, this seems really, really intimidating, what appears to be unfolding in the world. God, what should I do right now? How should I be responding to this? And that was sort of the idea that came into my head as a result of saying that prayer to myself. I heard a small voice that said, right now is your opportunity to be a source of poise. In other words, don't panic, because you know that you have a higher power. You don't need to just rely on yourself. You have somebody bigger than you that you can draw from. So be a source of poise. That's that calm type of confidence, even in the face of a crisis. Be a source of poise. Second is, be a source of help. In other words, give of yourself. Don't hold on to all of your resources. Don't say, I don't know what's going to happen to me, so I can't help anybody else. No, proactively go find people who need your help and give. Trust me, I'll take care of you. That's what the voice said to me. And the third thing is to be a source of hope. Because you can give people, a little bit of extra money, or you can give them the gift of your time. But ultimately what people need at the end of the day, before they lay their head on their pillow, is they need to have some reason for hope in the future. Yes, it's bad right now, but yes, it will end. And yes, things will get better. And when they do, then I'll still be here. So poise, help, and hope, and all of that comes from my faith, Daniel. And from that voice, as I said that prayer to myself, what should I do right now? And share that with other people. And I can only hope that at least one of them, maybe a couple of them, hopefully a lot of them, took some of that advice and it found its way into their way of responding to the crisis as well.
Okay, Mitch, it's been a joy to be with you today. So thank you so much. We appreciate so much your time and your wisdom and joyful and humble attitude in this. So we're so thankful for this time. And I'm sure that this time will be a source of hope and clarity for many of us. And it has helped me quite a lot to hear your answers as we struggle through this. And actually, I was saying today earlier to someone, we've never gone to a training for this before. Nobody has. Nobody alive has been to a training, a management training for this kind of crisis. So we need all the help we can get. And hearing your story and your advice has been so impactful and helpful for us. So thank you so much for taking the time. And actually, we do hope to see you back in Romania. And I don't want to force you to give an answer now, but we sincerely hope that you will consider that at the right time.
I'm sure I'll be back and I'll look forward to it. And it's been a true pleasure to be with all of you again. Thank you to Daniel. Thank you to Ruben for inviting me to again join the Guild. And I wish you all the very best and great success. And again, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. And we'll turn it over to Ruben. So thank you, Mitch.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Daniel. It was a great opportunity to have you this evening together with us at Guild Talks webinar event. We had a great discussion about crisis management, essential strategies, and my personal takeaway is that crisis magnifies what is already true. I have to prepare for the crisis and take advantage of it. And I have to take a deep breath and to ask, what can I do to be a source of hope, poise, and help others? I would appreciate if you can leave your takeaways in the chat. That would be great. And also, we have prepared for you a feedback formula. It would be wonderful if you can help us with the feedback. We want to improve this meetings, these webinars that we have together. And we really appreciate your feedback. It's only 1 minute or 30 seconds of your time, but it's great information for us because we want to make it better next time. And our goal is to help promote accountability and to promote moral integrity and professional competence in all spheres of society. I want to thank our collaborators, decenu.eu from Oradea, Lead Impact from Bucharest, Upgrade to Java, that are collaborators in organizing this event, and we are grateful for that, for all the promotions, and we are happy with each of you that were here tonight. We will see you next time. We organize this type of events every quarter or even sooner in this time. And please leave your feedback with us. And if you want to keep in contact with our community, please follow us on Facebook, and we will keep in touch with the next events. In the chat, you have a direct link to the feedback. So I will encourage you to write us a feedback. If some of you would like to share with us the takeaway, we are grateful for that too. Thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Mitch, and everybody that participated this evening. We want to have you back next time. And until then, good luck with the crisis. See you next time.